Hello, we are looking at why preterism. For those who don't know, preterism is simply the belief that many or all of the end times prophecies are already fulfilled. Full preterism, which would say that all prophecies are already fulfilled, including the second coming and saying that there's no bodily resurrection, is considered by many to be a heresy. That's not what I'm talking about today. If someone comes to you and says, hey, do you know that the preterists say this and this and this? Well, make sure you find out which type of preterism it is, because in a very, very broad scope, there's at least 3 major types of it. I'm not talking about the first 2. I'm talking down at the bottom one. Mild preterism, which would not even say that most of the prophecies were fulfilled in 70 AD, which would be moderate. I'm talking about mild, which would say that most of them are fulfilled in the first few centuries. So I'm making that distinction. However, I am simply talking about preterism simply to use economy of language. But there are other things out there, so please differentiate them. I'm not talking about the first 2, only the last one. Why preterism? Of course, probably everyone would have this answer. Hopefully, if they don't, then certainly steer away from them. But the reason why is because Scripture itself, we believe that it points to preterism. Number 2, historical fulfillment. Did it happen? Did it happen the way that the Bible said it was going to happen? We believe that this is yes. We believe that it does. And number 3, theological accuracy. Does it fit the overall themes of Scripture? And we believe that in some places, while we think that preterism does, we think it sometimes fits better than futurism. We think that futurism has a few errors in it. That's why we're doing this series of Why Preterism. Now, today, usually I go right to the Word. I have been doing a series of these, looking at different spots in the Word that I think clearly point to, more clearly in some places than others, but the overall thrust of these is that they're all pointing in the direction of preterism. I believe that this is the proper way to look at things and not through the lens of futurism, which says Revelation is yet to come. Most of the events in Daniel are yet to come. I don't think that's the right way to go. For the most part, I've been going to a verse or 2 or a handful of verses and looking at it that way. From time to time, however, it is necessary to look at some other points of view, especially in terms of concise, well put together rebuttals by other Bible teachers, prophecy teachers. And so that's what I'm going to do really quick. I'm going to go over to one of my websites. This right here is my website, beyondrevelation.com. It is simply a representation of some of my collected thoughts and writings on the subject of Revelation that I have put together in a nice little website. I'm not particularly here to advertise the website, although you can feel more than free to go up to beyondrevelation.com and peruse as much as you want, especially click over here on the study section. I made it all hard to find. All my writings are over here, and the rest of this menu is just boilerplate. It works, but it's kind of all you want. This part right here, study. What I want to look at today is a short paragraph from a larger document. I have reproduced it here. The organization that puts this out has the same right to copyright as I do. My copyright is the right to copy, and so is theirs, so I have done so. My purpose for copying is simply to represent it here, and throughout the page, I rebut the thing. It's a rebuttal page. So that's what I'm going to do in this short little video. I'm going to read this one little paragraph. Who it's by doesn't really matter. They have an entire document called 150 Chapters on the End Times, and this is one section towards the end of it. It is a very good reference. I disagree with their findings. They find that about 15%, or about 150, actually about 169 chapters, they say at least over half of them refers to the end times. They say about 15% of the chapters in the Bible refer to the end times. As I calculated it out, I found that more like about 4 or 5% actually point to the end times. Most of them are actually already fulfilled. So with that introduction, let me read the statements concerning what this particular well-respected Bible teacher says about preterism. Again, he's looking more, if you notice, he's talking about the events of 70 AD do not fulfill the prophecies about the end times. He is mostly looking at moderate preterism. He is not looking at what I'm calling mild preterism, which is that most of these were fulfilled through the first few centuries. However, many of the points are still the same. And so, with that, I will begin reading right here, if you can see my mouse. Discussion. The events of, this is him writing, the events of 70 AD do not fulfill the prophecies about the end times. Jesus prophesied that the Great Tribulation will be the most severe time in world history. It will surpass all other times of crisis. Some seek to minimize this prophecy by reducing it to symbolism or seeing it as totally fulfilled in 70 AD. The Great Tribulation will be so severe that God shortens it to 3.5 years to keep the entire human race from being physically killed, according to Matthew 24, verses 21 through 22. 1 million people died in 70 AD, and in World War II, 50 million died. Neither 70 AD nor World War II came close to threatening the existence of the human race as the Great Tribulation will. And neither of them was the worst time in history. The events of 70 AD were clearly a prophetic foreshadowing of the Great Tribulation. However, they did not fulfill most of the details about the Great Tribulation in Scripture. For example, Jesus said the Great Tribulation would not happen until we see the abomination of desolation that results in an unprecedented number of deaths. He cites Revelation 6:8, Revelation 9:15. The details concerning the abomination of desolation in Revelations 13:11 through 18, including a talking image, the mark of the beast, a head wound, mandatory worship of the Antichrist that is worldwide, and a false prophet. None of these details were fulfilled in the Jewish revolt against Rome, 66 to 70 AD. In that crisis, Jerusalem and the Second Temple were destroyed in 70 AD. Masada fell in 73 AD. Then in the Bar Kokhba rebellion against Rome, 132 to 135 AD, the Jews rebelled against Rome again, resulting in 500,000 Jews being killed, and 1,000 villages being destroyed. Israel was driven into exile, the diaspora, and Jerusalem was rebuilt and renamed as Aelia Capitolina. So this is what writes a popular Bible teacher. Again, the identity is really kind of irrelevant. I'm sure you could find it if you wanted to. Specifically, to break down all of these claims, my list of identifications is completely gone. So I will simply do it on the fly. I had written down some bullet points, but they're missing. So I will do it straight from here. So we have to break down a few different misconceptions that he has in here. First of all, we are not talking about simply 70 AD. We are looking at the entire range of things from around 60 AD up through, say, about 360 AD, or maybe 460 AD, up through the end of the Roman Empire. We believe these accomplish Revelations 6 through chapter 19. Now, the first chapter of Revelation is just can be considered introduction. The second two chapters are about the letters to the 7 churches, and chapters 4 and 5 are about the throne room. So most people consider the prescriptive content to be Revelation 6 and onward, beginning with the 6 seals and opening the book that is received in chapters 4 and 5. So what we see is most of the prophetic content to be chapters 6 through 19, and what we see is that the first few centuries of the church accomplished Revelations 6 through about 19 of 22 chapters. But what this means down here, when this particular writer is speaking about the abomination of desolation, we believe this happened in, I might get the number here, 66 and a half AD. 3.5 years before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, our definition of what this abomination was is, of course, different than his. If we just start there, because that's a good point to focus on. His reference is to claim that Revelations 13, 11 through 18 is about the abomination of desolation. But this is a point of interpretation. By our understanding, Revelations chapter 13 is not talking about the same time as the abomination of desolation that is mentioned in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24 says that the abomination of desolation will come first. However, Revelations 13, many have assumed that because it talks about an image, and the first abomination that Antiochus Epiphanes put in a few centuries before Christ was a statue of Zeus on the altar of sacrifice in the outer courts of the temple. Many people assume that it's the same thing. But again, that is strictly interpretation. Where we see the Revelations 13, 11 through 18, we see that fulfilled in the life of one of the emperors after the destruction of 70 AD, which differentiates us, of course, from the moderate preterists who say that it was all accomplished in 70 AD. We actually agree with this Bible teacher statements. The events of 70 AD do not fulfill the prophecies about the end times, and where we agree is right here, Revelations 13, 11 through 18. The events of 70 AD do not fulfill Revelations 13. However, the events of 60 to 360 or so AD do fulfill the events of Revelation, in most of the events of Revelation, including Revelations 13. As for the Revelations 13 specifically, what we're really looking at in our understanding, in our interpretation, is the Emperor Domitian several years after 70 AD. Emperor Domitian was reigning in the 90s. He actually did erect a statue to himself in the city of Ephesus. He had mandatory worship. As for a false prophet, many consider the cult of the emperor that required the worship to be this false prophet. And again, we detail this. We detail this in the website in various places. I have a book out there if you want to go find it, whatever. But we see these things as fulfilled later. These weren't, and again, these are not abomination of desolation scriptures. It never says in Revelation 13 that these are the abomination of desolation. So this is simply him putting his own interpretational requirements on the passage. Now, I think that the 70 AD fulfillment falls short because it doesn't accomplish, it doesn't take into account the at face value interpretation of these things. It kind of skips these things altogether, and it really I have never seen an adequate representation of these things in a 70 AD chronology. However, that's not what we're talking about here in this video. But the one point of detail that is important here is his assertion here and elsewhere. Let me highlight this with my mouse just to... He highlights here that it's worldwide. Now, we have to differentiate what the word is actually saying. Just as Daniel chapter 2 says that Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and the fourth kingdom, whatever identity it is, we believe that it's ancient Rome, it says that they ruled over all the earth. Daniel 2:39. That's the Bible's language for what they ruled. Now, we understand that it's the known earth or the civilized world. And that is what most of the... We have to understand that what the Bible considers to be the whole earth is subject to context. What we have here, when one assumes that it has to be worldwide, you take a modern interpretation, a modern understanding of what worldwide is, and what this language means. It's not that the other cases in Daniel are imprecise. This is what the words meant then, that it consisted of the entire known world or civilized world. This was simply the meaning and the connotation of the words there. And what we're doing when we put words like worldwide here, we're taking a modern connotation and a modern understanding of a translation of that word and putting it back into the original text, which places like Daniel 2:39, when it says the second and the third empire, which both I and this teacher would agree were Media, Persia, and Greece, it says that they ruled over the whole earth. Well, things like this, first of all, are put into a modern context of what worldwide is. The other example of this in this paragraph that he has, however, are phrases like the entire human race from being physically killed. Now his reference is Matthew 24. It's the Olivet Discourse. It says, unless that time had been cut short, no flesh would have been saved. Now the modern interpretation of that verse, the modern futurist interpretation, means the entire human race. What the verse says is different than the modern interpretation. The modern interpretation may be right, the modern interpretation may be wrong, but it is an interpretation. The text says no flesh would be saved. But context is everything. You always have to consider the context. And what is the context of Matthew 24? Well, first of all, it's Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. This is where the disciples are looking at the buildings of the temple. Jesus says not one stone will be left on another. He says, in fact, he uses the language, as for what you see here, meaning that which is visible to the eye, the then visible buildings, or the second temple, or Herod's temple. He couldn't have been talking about any other temple. By his own language, he said, by what you see. This is what the disciples are asking about then. He said, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They ask several questions there at the beginning of Matthew. But the context of the question is, first of all, Jerusalem, and specifically the temple and the Temple Mount. Now, Jesus' answer, he lays it out in very good form. He develops the things that will happen up to there before he finally gets to the answering of when around Matthew 24, verses 34 and 36. Basically, he's answering two questions there. He's saying these things will happen within this generation, meaning the destruction of Jerusalem then. And verse 36, he says, but that day, no one knows the day or the hour. What is that day? That day is referring to Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. The second coming there is actually a separate event that he's talking about. And it's unfortunate there has been historically an imprecise translation in Matthew 24:29. The word there is not immediately. If you study out the Greek there, it is euthios de meta. Euthios should be more straightway, directly. De meta means but after. A straightway but after, or directly but after. There isn't really a direct connection, temporal connection, to say that there's no middle time there. So what Jesus did is he describes the first event, he describes the second event, and he establishes the timing of the two. But nowhere in Matthew 24, verses 21 and 22, does it say the entire human race. It says no flesh would be saved from this great tribulation. So the context is the great tribulation. But where is this great tribulation? Now, as we saw in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel said, in around Daniel 9, 11 or 12, thereabouts, Daniel had said up to that time the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem was the worst thing that had ever happened in history up until then. Daniel chapter 12 then goes into talking about the greatest, an even greater tragedy yet to come. And we have interpreted that, and we have shown through several other videos, that the Daniel 12, what is called it's coming on the heels of Daniel chapter 11, and Daniel chapter 11, starting at verse 36, has transitioned over to Rome. And so we're talking about the time of Rome, or we're talking about the first century right here. And so when this Bible teacher says that the 3.5 years to keep the entire human race from being physically killed, that is his supposition. Because context, and context alone, determines the scope of this. That time is shortened, lest no flesh should be saved. It is his opinion that that means the entire human race. It may be a popular sentiment in today's eschatological or prophetic circles, but it is certainly not in the text, because it is dependent first upon the context of the Great Tribulation in Matthew 21, second of all in the context of the Greater Olivet Discourse, which begins by talking about the then visible buildings. As one other teacher on Preterism pointed out, if the events in Matthew chapter 24 were global in scope, what good would it do for those people to flee from one spot to another? Second of all, when you're talking about other events, such as them seeing what's going on in the temple, yes, it makes good teaching points to say this has never been possible in human history because now we have worldwide TV. Well, there are many people who are not watching TV 24/7, and there's many people in the world that are not watching TV at all. And so the point is that even this is simply popular teaching and popular interpretation of what these events are. It never says the entire human race. It simply says that no flesh would be saved. Does that mean worldwide, like this Bible teacher interprets? Or does it mean that no flesh inside the city of Jerusalem, or possibly in the nation of Israel, would be saved during the siege and the war against Rome? The text certainly doesn't say. And this is 100% speculation. Now to a couple of his other points real quick. I've touched on some of these before, but they're fairly straightforward. He brings out a very, very real point here. He said that 1 million died. You could say 1 million or 1.5 million. Different numbers by different people, or they're just kind of estimates. But 1 million people were killed in 70 AD, and 50 million people were killed in World War II. However, just as an analogy, when Jesus saw one woman take 2 pennies and throw it in the treasury, he said that was more than people putting in huge sacks of money, because it was all that she had. So one cannot simply look at numbers. One cannot simply say, oh, there was 1 million people killed here, and there's 50 million people killed here, and so therefore, since World War II certainly wasn't the tribulation, and if World War II was more people killed than 70 AD, then it must be something different. It simply doesn't work that way. One has to look at the proportion of the whole. One has to look at degree of suffering. One has to look at the cruelty of that which was put upon the people. Now, we've all seen, I've used this analogy before, but we've all seen the documentaries of World War II. Hitler, the History Channel, not the Hitler Channel. The History Channel that shows many of these documentaries. Many people were shown these things in grade school, whatnot. We've all seen the World War II documentaries, the concentration camps. What no one has ever seen, because it does not exist, is the black and white footage from 70 AD. Now, according to Josephus, women ate their own children, cooked them, and ate them. According to Josephus, towards the end of the siege, when General Titus had put siege walls around it. Now, you have to understand, he put those siege walls up at Passover. It wasn't just a city. It says in the Psalms, Jerusalem is a city built compact together. It was a dense city already. But this was feast time when Titus put up these siege walls. All able-bodied men in the entire nation were in Jerusalem. It's like having all of your extended family living in your already compact house, but not just you, all of your neighbors in the entire city. Then the walls go up, no one enters, no one leaves. This is what the conditions started out with in the siege of Jerusalem. Then, the rebels, there was about 3 different warring factions of rebels in the city, who all wanted war and wanted to revolt against the Romans, thinking that their little nation could overthrow Rome. They were all fighting against each other, and to incite the people who were in the city to revolt and to fight, they burned their own food supply. They had plenty of food in warehouses. They could have lasted a very long time inside their city walls. They didn't have to worry about the Romans. They burned their own food supply, and so starvation set in. And towards the end of the siege, Josephus' reports were that over 500 Jews every day were crucified outside the city walls. Now, it's not to say that there was anything humane about any horrible, evil world dictator, but we've all seen the concentration camps, the ovens, the gas chambers, and the gross disregard for human life in 70 AD. But in World War II. But I don't think that ever really comes to grips with the level of cruel insanity of, say, Emperor Nero just before the revolt, where Emperor Nero took Christians, dipped them in hot wax, tied them to poles, and this is a little bit graphic here, but he lit them on fire alive and used them as lights for his street lights for his parties. In all of the Nazi Germany's madness, they never went that far, as far as I know, and I might not even know the half of it on the first century either. What is going on here is we don't know what 70 AD was really like. We haven't seen the videos. We haven't watched the documentaries. Ultimately, I think, if you want to have a debate about which one was worse, you can have the Jews debate, the Jews from World War II debate with the Jews from the first century and have them decide which one of those was worse. In World War II, there was about 9 million Jews living in Europe. 6 million of those were killed. The other third passed through a fire. But which suffering was worse? They both faced mass slaughter. They both faced starvation. I would venture to say, just from what I know about it, just from reading about Josephus, in my understanding, in my very little understanding of the subject, I would still say that 70 AD topped even Hitler's madness in the 1940s. But as for, and so when we look at this Bible teacher's arguments, is that neither of them came close to threatening the existence of the human race. What they're thinking about is nuclear weapons. But that's not necessary to fulfill the prophecy. To threaten the existence of the human race is not the same thing as that no flesh would be saved. Had not the siege ended in 70 AD, likely there may not have been any Jews that were rescued from the city. It could have been that the no flesh would be saved could have been the Jews in Israel. But finally the siege did end, and there were many that got out of the city despite the severe hunger and the extreme suffering. And so this author goes on and says that the 70 AD were a prophetic foreshadowing. But again, I would say that 70 AD, in my understanding, appears to be worse than even Hitler in World War II. That Hitler didn't come close to the cruelty and madness of the first century. And as for the abomination of desolation, we've covered that in another video. We believe that this was fulfilled 3.5 years before the fall of the temple. One of the priests, Ananias ben Hananiah, he stopped the daily sacrifice to Caesar. That was the 3.5 year mark to the destruction of the temple. And those dates are confirmed. Again, we see that Revelation 13 applies to after 70 AD. Some 10, 20, 30 years afterwards, when Emperor Domitian built a statue of himself and forced mandatory worship, not worldwide, but it doesn't say that in Revelation 13. He forced worship, including, from the best that I can find out, he probably required a mark in order to buy or sell there in the city market. But as for the rest of this, we follow him in his chronology. Jerusalem and the Second Temple were destroyed in 70 AD. The Bar Kokhba rebellion we see also represented in the book of Revelation. But Jerusalem was at this point destroyed. But the real marker in this, I think, is Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. Until to accomplish the scattering of the power of the holy people, all these things from Daniel's prophecy are fulfilled. This is where I feel that this Bible teacher simply is bringing in many very modern, very popular interpretations into the text, and he's, for whatever reason, he is simply not addressing the other things in this short little condensed paragraph. While I appreciate the presentation here, I feel that it doesn't really undermine or threaten the position of a mild preterism. The part about Revelations 13 and not addressing the mark of the beast, the head wound, these things are could be sticking points for moderate preterism or for full preterists. But really, his main point here to me has always been the comparison between World War II and 70 AD. And as I said, you have to look at more than simply a body count. How many people were killed by these things? Something has happened in the last 2,000 years called the church. And the influence of the church has actually been a preservation in society that the level of cruelty and madness has not been seen that was seen in first century Rome, and we simply do not see eye to eye with this Bible teacher in saying that the events of 70 AD do not fulfill them. As we said, we agree with this statement at face value. We don't see that the events of 70 AD fulfill the prophecies. However, looked at a broader whole, looking at Revelations 13, not as a prophecy about the abomination of desolation, which has to happen before the tribulation, or before whatever, looking at that as something that came after 70 AD in our perspective, we see that the events of the first few centuries of the church did accomplish the events or the prophecies about the end times. And so on that, we disagree with this popular Bible teacher. However, we appreciate his efforts and we appreciate his studies into these things. But the ultimate conclusions drawn in these and the rebuttal against preterism in general, we find that they fall flat. Thank you very much.